Ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were using your loyalty as a weapon against you? If stories of justice against workplace bullies resonate with you, hitting subscribe helps me bring you more of these true accounts. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? I love connecting with people who understand that sometimes the quietest person in the room has the most powerful story. The burgundy leather appointment book sat on Richard's mahogany desk like it always did, its gold-embossed corners catching the morning light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. 47 floors above Manhattan's financial district, I'd arranged that book every morning for 12 years, never questioning what went inside. Until January 2024, when everything changed. I was Margaret Sullivan then, Maggie to everyone who mattered. Though after what happened, I learned exactly how few people that really was. At 56, I'd spent more than half my life in that gleaming tower, climbing from a 22-year-old girl who'd never owned anything leather to the executive assistant who knew where every body was buried. Or so I thought. The morning that shattered everything started like any other. Richard Blackwood III breezed into his office at exactly 7:45 a.m., his expensive cologne, something French and woody that probably cost more than most people's rent, announcing his arrival before he rounded the corner. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit immaculate, his smile warm and paternal. "Morning, Maggie. Coffee smells perfect as always." I handed him the steaming cup, 2 sugars, splash of cream, temperature precise enough to sip immediately, and watched him settle behind his desk. The burgundy appointment book lay open to today's page, filled with my careful handwriting in blue ink. Board meeting at 9. Lunch with Henderson at 12:30. 3 o'clock with Yamamoto Industries. Routine. Safe. Exactly how I'd built my life. Pull the pension fund reports for Q4, would you? Henderson wants to see the allocation breakdown. Richard's voice carried that easy authority that came from being born to wealth, educated at Princeton, groomed to command. I nodded and turned toward the filing cabinet, my heels clicking against the marble floor. That's when I noticed it, a tiny discrepancy in the previous month's vendor payments that made my breath catch. $500,000 to Meridian Consulting Services, a company I'd never heard of despite handling every invoice that crossed Richard's desk. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled the Henderson file, but I kept my voice steady. "Richard, I'm not seeing Meridian Consulting in our usual vendor database. Should I add them?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. When I turned around, Richard's face had shifted almost imperceptibly. The warm smile tightened at the corners. His eyes sharpened with something that might have been calculation. "Old contract from before your system upgrade. Don't worry about it." But I did worry about it. That night, long after the cleaning crew had finished and the building's lights had dimmed to emergency levels, I stayed at my desk with the burgundy appointment book open beside me. I traced my finger down the meetings Richard had attended in January, cross-referencing them with the vendor payments I'd processed. Meridian Consulting had been paid on the same day Richard met with M. Carlyle at the Union Club, a meeting that hadn't appeared on his public calendar, only in the private appointments section of the leather book that I maintained but never questioned. 3 more payments, 3 more mysterious meetings, all for exactly $500,000, all coming directly from the Employee Pension Fund. 2 weeks later, I had a system. Every evening after Richard left, usually around 6, sometimes later if he was nervous about something, I'd return to my desk with a cup of chamomile tea and spread the files across the polished surface like a puzzle demanding to be solved. The burgundy appointment book sat open beside my computer monitor, its pages revealing a pattern that made my stomach twist tighter each night. Meridian Consulting wasn't the only ghost company bleeding our pension fund dry. Atlantic Advisory Solutions, Pacific Strategic Partners, Continental Investment Group, each one paid exactly $500,000. Each payment authorized by Richard's signature, each corresponding to a private meeting marked in the appointment book with initials I was beginning to recognize. MC, AA, PS, CI. The same initials that appeared on shell company registrations I found buried in Delaware corporate filings during my late-night internet searches. By February, I'd documented 12 fraudulent payments totaling $6 million. Money that belonged to our employees. People like Janet in accounting who was counting on her pension to care for her disabled son, or Marcus in facilities who'd worked double shifts for 20 years to build his retirement nest egg. Money that was disappearing into Richard's private accounts through an elaborate shell game that would have impressed Bernie Madoff. The worst part? I'd been the one enabling it. Every fake meeting I'd scheduled, every mysterious consultant I'd added to his calendar without question, every time I'd nodded and smiled when Richard praised my discretion, my loyalty, my ability to handle sensitive matters without unnecessary questions. I'd been the perfect accomplice, and I hadn't even known it. The revelation that broke something inside me came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was organizing Richard's personal files, a monthly task he'd assigned me years ago, when I found the folder marked Sullivan M. Personnel, my own file, containing performance reviews I'd never seen, salary recommendations that explained why my raises had been so modest, and at the bottom, a single sheet of paper that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped it. It was a psychological evaluation, dated June 1994, just after I'd been promoted to executive assistant following my predecessor's sudden departure. Subject demonstrates excessive loyalty traits stemming from childhood economic instability. Poverty background creates strong need for approval and security. Unlikely to question authority figures who provide financial stability. Ideal candidate for handling sensitive information requiring absolute discretion. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Patricia Vance, the industrial psychologist Richard's father had used for decades to evaluate key personnel. They hadn't promoted me because I was competent. They'd promoted me because I was controllable. I sat in that empty office for 20 minutes, reading and rereading those clinical words that reduced 12 years of what I'd thought was mutual respect to a calculated manipulation. The burgundy appointment book seemed to mock me from across the desk, its leather binding warm from the morning sun, but cold as ice in my understanding. When Richard arrived that day, I was waiting. "We need to talk about the pension fund transfers," I said before he'd even set down his briefcase. His cologne hit me like always, but now it smelled cloying, desperate. The mask of paternal warmth slipped for just a moment, revealing something sharp and hungry underneath. "What transfers, Maggie?" I opened the appointment book to February 15th. "Your meeting with Monsieur Carlyle at the Union Club." The same day, Meridian Consulting received another $500,000 from the Employee Pension Fund. I flipped the page. February 22nd, AA at the Harvard Club. Atlantic Advisory Solutions, same amount. Richard's jaw tightened. "Those are legitimate business expenses." "No, they're not." My voice was steadier than I felt. "I spent 3 weeks tracking down these companies. They don't exist, Richard. They're shell corporations registered to P.O. boxes in Delaware. The money goes in and immediately transfers to offshore accounts." The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its usual chaos, but inside that corner office, I could hear my own heartbeat and the soft tick of the antique clock Richard's grandfather had given him. "You've been busy," he said finally. "You've been stealing." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. Richard's face went through a series of micro-expressions. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been disappointment, and finally, a cold fury I'd never seen before. "Stealing is such an ugly word, Maggie. I prefer temporarily reallocating assets during a liquidity crisis." $6 million, Richard. That's not temporary, and it's not yours. He stood up slowly, moving around the desk until he was close enough that I could see the tiny red veins in his eyes, smell the faint sourness beneath his expensive cologne. When he spoke, his voice was soft and dangerous. "Do you know what happened to the last person who sat in your chair?" Patricia Williams was her name. Lovely girl, very thorough, asked too many questions about things that weren't her concern. My mouth went dry. "What happened to her?" "She had an accident. Fell down the subway stairs at 42nd Street during rush hour. Terrible thing. Broke her neck." His smile was thin and cold. "Of course she was drunk at the time. Had been for months, according to witnesses. Tragic how some people can't handle the pressure of executive-level responsibilities. The threat was crystal clear, delivered with the same casual tone he used to discuss lunch reservations. I thought about Patricia Williams, whose name I'd never heard before this moment, who'd sat at my desk and discovered what I'd discovered and paid for it with her life. You're scaring me, Richard. Good. Fear keeps people alive, Maggie. Loyalty keeps them employed. Which are you going to choose? I looked down at the burgundy appointment book, at 12 years of careful handwriting, documenting meetings and managing schedules and enabling crimes I'd been too trusting to recognize. The morning light streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows felt different now, harsh instead of golden, exposing instead of illuminating. When I looked back up at Richard, something fundamental had shifted in my chest. The desperate need for his approval, for the security his employment provided, for the illusion of the father figure he'd never actually been. All of it cracked apart like ice in spring. I choose neither, I said quietly. I choose justice. Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. Justice? From who exactly? You think anyone's going to believe the word of a secretary against a Blackwood? You think your little file folder of circumstantial evidence is going to bring down a family that's been building this city since before your grandparents were born? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're going to go home tonight, Maggie. You're going to throw away whatever amateur detective work you've been doing. Tomorrow morning, you're going to come in here and pretend this conversation never happened. And in exchange, I'm going to pretend I never saw you rifling through confidential files after hours. And if I don't, then you'll discover that Patricia Williams wasn't the only person to have an accident while crossing Richard Blackwood. He straightened his tie and smoothed his silver hair, the genial mask sliding back into place like he'd just flipped a switch. Now I have a 10 o'clock with the Henderson Group. Please make sure the conference room is set up properly. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the burgundy appointment book and thinking about Patricia Williams and the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The leather felt different under my fingers now. Not smooth and professional, but slippery, treacherous. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour copy center in Queens and spent 3 hours duplicating every document I'd collected, every page from the appointment book that showed the pattern, every bank record that proved the theft. I put one set in a safety deposit box I opened under my maiden name. Another set went to my sister in Buffalo, mailed with instructions she wouldn't understand until later. The third set, I kept. By dawn, I was back at my desk, outwardly the same efficient assistant I'd always been. But inside, something had crystallized. Richard thought he could control me with fear, manipulate me with threats, dispose of me like he had Patricia Williams. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. The next 3 months were the longest performance of my life. Every morning, I smiled and handed Richard his coffee. Every afternoon, I scheduled his meetings and typed his correspondence. Every evening I stayed late, not to investigate anymore, but to perfect the act of being the compliant assistant he thought he'd terrorized back into submission. But compliance and surrender aren't the same thing. While Richard believed he'd won, I was building a case that would destroy him. The breakthrough came in May, when I received a call that changed everything. I was organizing Richard's travel itinerary for a trip to the Cayman Islands, another red flag I noted but didn't comment on, when my phone rang. Is this Margaret Sullivan? The voice was crisp, professional, with a slight accent I couldn't place. This is she. My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm an attorney specializing in whistleblower protection. I understand you might need my services. My blood turned to ice. I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong... Patricia Williams was my client 12 years ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. I glanced toward Richard's office, but he was on a conference call, gesticulating at his computer screen with typical theatrical flair. I can't talk here, I whispered. Starbucks on 47th and Lexington. 1 hour. I'll be wearing a red scarf and carrying a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The line went dead. I spent the next hour in a state of controlled panic, my hands shaking as I typed routine emails and answered phones. When I told Richard I needed to step out for a doctor's appointment, he barely looked up from his screen. Don't be long. The Yamamoto contracts need to go out today. Elena Rodriguez was exactly where she said she'd be, but she wasn't what I'd expected. Mid-40s, compact and fierce-looking, with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to see everything. The red scarf was cashmere, expensive but understated. This wasn't some ambulance chaser looking for a quick settlement. "You're taking a hell of a risk meeting with me," she said as I sat down across from her. "You mentioned Patricia Williams." Patricia was brave. Patricia was also naive. Elena's voice carried a weight that spoke of old grief, old failures. She came to me in June of 1994 with evidence of pension fund fraud at Blackwood Industries. Documented proof, just like what I suspect you have. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer. What happened? She got scared. Richard Blackwood convinced her that going public would destroy her life, that no one would believe her, that she'd never work again. So she took their settlement, $500,000 to keep quiet and disappear. But she died. 3 months later, fell down the subway stairs drunk as a lord at 2 in the afternoon. Patricia Williams, who'd been sober for 8 years and was terrified of subway platforms because of her claustrophobia. Elena's eyes were hard as flint. Funny how fear can drive people to drink, isn't it? The implication hung between us like smoke. Not murder exactly, but something worse. Psychological torture that had driven a whistleblower to self-destruction. Why are you telling me this? Because Patricia Williams was my father. Elena's voice cracked slightly. Not literally, but she might as well have been. My dad lost his pension when Continental Foods went under in '89. Executive fraud, almost identical to what Patricia discovered at Blackwood. He died broke and bitter, working at 73 because he couldn't afford to retire. She leaned forward, her intensity almost frightening. I've spent 15 years building cases like this. I've never lost one. And I've never charged a client a penny. The recoveries fund everything. What do you want from me? What I couldn't give Patricia: backup, protection. A way to fight back that doesn't end with hush money and guilt. Elena pulled out a business card, plain white with black lettering. But only if you're ready to go all the way. Half measures get people killed. I thought about the burgundy appointment book locked in my desk drawer, filled with evidence that could send Richard to prison. I thought about Patricia Williams, alone and terrified and ultimately destroyed by her own silence. I thought about Janet in accounting and Marcus in facilities, and all the other employees counting on money that was disappearing into Richard's offshore accounts. What would going all the way look like? You keep doing your job. You keep smiling and fetching coffee and scheduling meetings, but you also start wearing a wire. My breath caught. A wire? Recorded conversations. Richard admitting to the fraud, detailing how the shell companies work, ideally threatening you again for good measure. Combined with your financial documentation, it would be enough for federal prosecutors. The thought of walking back into that office, of sitting across from Richard while recording his every word, made me feel nauseated. And if he finds out? That's why you have me. I've done this dance before, Maggie. I know how to keep clients safe. But even as she said it, I could see the shadow of Patricia Williams in her eyes. The client she couldn't save, the father who died, broke. The weight of cases that had taught her that safety was never guaranteed. I need time to think. You don't have time. Richard's planning something for the annual company gala next month. Patricia mentioned it before she disappeared. Said he always used the gala to make major announcements. Reset the narrative when things got complicated. The annual gala. The crown jewel of Richard's social calendar, where 300 of Manhattan's financial elite gathered to celebrate Blackwood Industries' continued success. Where Richard would stand at the podium in his perfectly tailored tuxedo and charm the crowd with stories of growth and prosperity, all while the pension fund hemorrhaged money into his personal accounts. What kind of announcement? The kind that eliminates problems permanently. New policies, personnel changes, corporate restructuring that makes whistleblowing impossible. Elena's voice was grim. If you're going to move, it has to be before that gala. I looked out the Starbucks window at the stream of people hurrying past on Lexington Avenue. Office workers and tourists and families, all living their lives without knowing that 47 floors above them, A man in an expensive suit was stealing their neighbor's retirements one wire transfer at a time. "If I do this," I said slowly, "and if we get him, what happens to me?" Whistleblower protection laws are stronger than they were in Patricia's day. Federal witness protection if necessary. And the recovery funds. Elena smiled for the first time since I'd sat down. "Last case like this, my client received $4 million as her share of the recovered assets. $4 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to never worry about security or approval or whether someone's kindness was real or calculated. But that wasn't what decided me. What decided me was remembering the clinical words in my personnel file, the casual way Richard had described Patricia's accident, the 12 years I'd spent being grateful for scraps from a man who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool. How does the wire work? Elena's smile became predatory. Very carefully. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the burgundy appointment book open beside me, planning the destruction of the man who'd shaped my adult life. The leather binding felt different now, not treacherous or slippery, but solid, reliable. It was going to be the key to everything. The wire was smaller than I'd expected, barely the size of a button, designed to clip inside my bra where it would be invisible, but close enough to my heart to pick up every terrified beat along with Richard's voice. Elena had trained me for 3 days in a safe house apartment in Queens, teaching me how to steer conversations toward admissions, how to appear natural while ensuring the recording device captured everything, how to stay calm when Richard inevitably said something that made my blood freeze. "Remember," she'd said, checking the device one final time, "you're not trying to entrap him. You're documenting crimes that are already happening. Let him talk. Predators love to brag when they think they're safe." The first recording session happened on a Tuesday morning in June. I was refilling Richard's coffee when he took a call from someone he clearly thought was a trusted associate. "The Cayman account is clean," I heard him say as I arranged papers on his desk, moving slowly to give the wire time to capture everything. "Meridian transferred the latest batch yesterday. We're at 8.5 million now." 8.5 million. More than I'd documented, which meant the theft was accelerating. No, don't worry about Sullivan," Richard continued, glancing at me with that paternal smile that now made my skin crawl. "She had her little moment of conscience, but she's back in line. Aren't you, Maggie?" I smiled back, the expression feeling like broken glass in my face. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. See? Loyal as a golden retriever. The evaluation was right. Give her a little security and she'll roll over for anything." The evaluation. Dr. Patricia Vance's psychological assessment that had mapped out my weaknesses like a blueprint for exploitation. I kept my smile steady while fury burned in my chest like acid. When Richard hung up, he was almost jovial. "Maggie, I want you to start planning something special for the gala. Something that shows the board how much I value loyalty, how I take care of people who take care of me. What did you have in mind? A tribute to long-term employees who've been instrumental in our success. I'm thinking of giving you a special recognition, maybe a little bonus, some public acknowledgement of your dedication." The words should have thrilled me. 12 years ago, even 12 months ago, Richard's public praise would have made me glow with pride. Now, understanding the game he was playing, they felt like a noose tightening around my neck. "That's very generous. You deserve it. You've been absolutely perfect, Maggie. Discreet, loyal, never asking inconvenient questions. Patricia Williams could have learned something from you." The casual mention of his previous victim made my hands shake. I busied myself organizing his desk calendar to hide the tremor, but Richard noticed everything when he was in predator mode. "You seem nervous lately. Everything all right at home?" "Just tired. I've been working late a lot." "Well, after the gala, things should calm down considerably. I'm making some organizational changes that will streamline operations, eliminate redundancies." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Sometimes you have to prune the tree to keep it healthy." I nodded and fled to my desk, my heart hammering against the wire hidden in my bra. Back at my computer, I pulled up the guest list for the annual gala and tried to focus on seating arrangements and dietary restrictions while Richard's voice echoed in my head. "Sometimes you have to prune the tree." That evening, Elena and I sat in her car outside a diner in Queens, listening to the recordings on a device that looked like an oversized smartphone. 8.5 million, Elena said, shaking her head. We had him at 6 million from your documentation. He's accelerated the theft since you confronted him. And the thing about pruning the tree? Corporate restructuring. He's planning to eliminate positions that pose a threat, probably starting with anyone who has access to financial records. Elena's expression was grim. Including you. At the gala? It's perfect theater. Public recognition for your loyal service, followed by a gracious retirement package. Golden handshake, generous severance, maybe a nice reference letter, and a very clear understanding that speaking about anything you might have observed would be a violation of your confidentiality agreement. I thought about Patricia Williams, who'd taken a similar deal and ended up drunk and dead 3 months later. What if I refuse? Then you have an accident, or a breakdown, or suddenly develop a drinking problem that makes anything you say unreliable. Elena's voice was matter-of-fact. He's had 12 years to perfect this process. The weight of it settled over me like a burial shroud. Richard wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who'd turned corporate psychology into a weapon, identifying vulnerable women and using their own needs against them. How many Patricia Williamses had there been over the years? How many loyal assistants had discovered inconvenient truths and been quietly eliminated? We need more, Elena said, ejecting the memory card from the recording device. This is good, but we need him confessing to the murders. Patricia wasn't murdered. You said she drank herself. Patricia was systematically destroyed by someone who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. That's not legally murder, but it's close enough for a federal prosecutor if we can prove intent. Elena started the car. Can you get him talking about her? I don't know. He's been careful about that. Then we make him careless. Stress does that to predators. Makes them overconfident, eager to brag about their cleverness. She pulled out into traffic. How comfortable are you with playing a little psychological warfare? The next morning, I arrived early and left a single sheet of paper on Richard's desk. A copy of the Wall Street Journal article about a corporate whistleblower case from 1993, where an executive assistant had exposed pension fraud and received $1 million reward. When Richard found it, his face went white. Where did this come from? Oh, that? It was mixed in with your morning briefings. Interesting case, isn't it? The assistant was so brave. I kept my voice light, curious. I wonder what happened to her after the trial. She was destroyed, Richard said flatly. Blacklisted from every decent company in the city. Last I heard, she was working retail in some strip mall in New Jersey. That seems unfair. She was just doing the right thing. The right thing? Richard's laugh was bitter. She bit the hand that fed her, Maggie. Betrayed people who trusted her with confidential information. You can't do that and expect to live happily ever after. I nodded thoughtfully, as if I was genuinely considering his perspective. I suppose loyalty has to mean something. Exactly. Loyalty is everything in this business. It's why I've always valued you so highly. He picked up the burgundy appointment book, turning it over in his hands like a talisman. Some people don't understand that boundaries exist for good reasons. They think their little moral crusades matter more than the damage they cause. Like Patricia Williams? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes sharp and dangerous. What about Patricia Williams? Nothing. Just, you mentioned her the other day. I was curious about what happened to her. Patricia made the same mistake that whistleblower did. She forgot who she worked for. Richard's voice was soft, contemplative, the tone of someone reminiscing about an interesting chess game. She thought she could threaten me, leverage her access to sensitive information for personal gain. So I taught her a lesson about the real world. My blood turned to ice, but I kept my expression neutral. The wire against my chest felt hot, urgent. What kind of lesson? The kind that sticks. See, Patricia's weakness wasn't greed or ambition. It was guilt. She had this overwhelming need to be right, to be the hero of her own story. So I gave her what she wanted. Richard smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen. I let her be right. I don't understand. I confirmed everything she suspected, admitted to the pension transfers, explained how the shell companies worked, even showed her some of the offshore accounts. She was so excited, so convinced she was about to bring down the corrupt executive and save the day. The appointment book creaked as his grip tightened. Then I showed her the psychological evaluation Dr. Vance had prepared, showed her exactly how we'd identified her as a target, how we'd manipulated her hiring, her promotion, her access to sensitive information, how her entire career had been a setup. I could barely breathe. Why would you tell her all that? Because I wanted her to understand how completely she'd been used. How her crusade for justice was really just the final act in a game she'd never known she was playing. Richard's eyes were distant, lost in the memory. The shame broke her, Maggie. She took the settlement money and tried to drink away the knowledge that she'd been a puppet from day one. And the subway accident was inevitable. When you destroy someone's sense of self, when you show them that their entire identity was a carefully constructed lie, he shrugged. Well, people make poor decisions when they're that broken. The recording device felt like it was burning against my skin. Richard had just confessed to psychological murder, described exactly how he'd weaponized Patricia Williams' conscience against her until she'd destroyed herself. That's terrible, I managed. It was necessary. Patricia forced my hand by threatening the company, threatening me, just like that other assistant in the newspaper article. Richard's smile returned, warm and paternal again. But you're smarter than that, aren't you, Maggie? You understand that some secrets are meant to be kept. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Good, because I'd hate for you to make the same mistake Patricia did. I'd hate to have to teach you the same lesson. He picked up his coffee and sipped it calmly, as if he hadn't just described orchestrating a woman's psychological destruction with the same casual tone he used to discuss the weather. That night, Elena and I sat in stunned silence as Richard's confession played through the speakers. His voice, captured in crystal clarity, detailing exactly how he'd broken Patricia Williams' mind and driven her to self-destruction. "We've got him," Elena said finally. But as I stared out at the Queen's skyline, all I could think about was the burgundy appointment book in Richard's hands, and how many other women's names might be written in its blood-stained pages. The Plaza Hotel ballroom glittered like a jewel box the night of the annual gala, crystal chandeliers casting warm amber light over 300 of Manhattan's financial elite. I stood near the service entrance in my black cocktail dress, the same one I'd worn to every company function for the past 3 years, watching Richard work the crowd with practiced charm. He looked magnificent in his custom tuxedo, silver hair gleaming, commanding attention with the effortless authority that came from generations of inherited power. No one watching him would guess that beneath that perfect exterior lurked a predator who destroyed lives with the same casual precision he used to arrange flowers. The wire pressed against my ribs like a secret heartbeat, recording every conversation, every laugh, every moment of this elaborate theater Richard had orchestrated. Elena's team was positioned throughout the hotel, FBI agents disguised as waitstaff and security, federal prosecutors mingling with the guests, U.S. Marshals ready to move the moment we had enough evidence to ensure conviction. Tonight was the end game. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed across the ballroom as he took the podium. The conversations died away, replaced by the expectant silence of people accustomed to being entertained by wealth and power. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate another extraordinary year at Blackwood Industries. As many of you know, this company has been built on 3 fundamental principles: innovation, integrity, and loyalty." The irony made my stomach clench. I moved closer to the front, ensuring the wire would capture every word clearly. Tonight, I want to recognize someone who embodies all 3 of those principles. Someone who has been the backbone of our executive operations for 12 remarkable years. My blood turned to ice as Richard's smile found me in the crowd. "Margaret Sullivan, would you please join me on stage?" The spotlight swung toward me, blinding and hot. 300 faces turned in my direction, some curious, some politely interested, most completely indifferent to the existence of an executive assistant. I felt my legs move without conscious direction, carrying me toward the stage and the trap Richard had so carefully prepared. Maggie has been more than an employee, Richard continued as I climbed the steps, my heels clicking against the polished wood. She's been a trusted confidant, a guardian of our most sensitive information, a woman whose discretion and loyalty have been absolutely beyond reproach. He handed me a crystal plaque, in recognition of extraordinary service and unwavering loyalty, and leaned close enough that his whisper wouldn't reach the microphone. "Smile, Maggie. This is your moment." I smiled. The crowd applauded politely. Richard's arm settled around my shoulders like a steel trap. "But tonight isn't just about recognition," he said, addressing the ballroom again. "It's about transition." After 12 years of dedicated service, Maggie has decided to pursue new opportunities. Tonight marks her final evening with Blackwood Industries. The words hit me like physical blows. He was doing it, eliminating the threat publicly, creating a narrative of voluntary departure that would make any future accusations seem like the bitter revenge of a disgruntled former employee. "Of course, we couldn't let her leave empty-handed," Richard continued. "Maggie will be receiving a generous severance package, full benefits continuation, and most importantly, our eternal gratitude for her years of faithful service." More applause. A few people actually seemed moved by this display of corporate benevolence. I stood there in the spotlight, holding the crystal plaque, feeling like a deer caught in headlights while the hunter lined up his shot. Now, before Maggie says a few words about her time with us, I want to share a story that I think captures her character perfectly. This wasn't part of any script we'd discussed. Richard was improvising, and improvisation meant danger. 6 months ago, Maggie discovered some irregularities in our financial records. Nothing serious, just some clerical errors that could have caused confusion if left uncorrected. But instead of ignoring them or handling them quietly, Maggie brought them to my attention immediately. The bastard was rewriting history in real time, turning my discovery of his crimes into evidence of my loyalty. She could have made assumptions, jumped to conclusions, maybe even caused unnecessary alarm. Instead, she trusted me to handle the situation appropriately, which I did. Those irregularities were corrected, our procedures were tightened, and thanks to Maggie's vigilance, Blackwood Industries is stronger than ever. I felt sick. He was using my own evidence against me, spinning my investigation into a tale of loyal service that had already been rewarded with internal corrections. If I tried to speak out now, it would sound like I was contradicting his generous praise, biting the hand that had just fed me so publicly. "Maggie?" Richard turned to me with that paternal smile. "Would you like to say something to our guests?" The microphone appeared in front of me, gleaming and expectant. 300 faces looked up from the ballroom floor. Behind them, I could see Elena near the bar, her expression tight with concern. The FBI agents in their waiter disguises had moved closer to the stage. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. I could play along with Richard's script, accept the golden handshake, and disappear into whatever comfortable exile he'd prepared for me. I could take the money and run, just like Patricia Williams had tried to do, and hope that guilt and shame didn't eventually drive me to the same dark place they'd driven her. Or I could burn it all down. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "You're absolutely right about my character. I have always been someone who brings problems to light, no matter how uncomfortable that might be." Richard's smile flickered slightly. He sensed the shift in my tone, but couldn't stop what was already in motion. "And you're also right about those financial irregularities I discovered. They were quite serious indeed." I turned to face the crowd directly, stepping slightly away from Richard's restraining arm. $8.5 million in pension fund money, transferred to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Money that belongs to every hardworking employee at Blackwood Industries. A murmur ran through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Richard's face went white, then red, then white again. "Maggie, I think you're confused." "I'm not confused, Richard. I've been documenting your fraud for months. Shell companies like Meridian Consulting, Atlantic Advisory Solutions, Pacific Strategic Partners, all registered to P.O. boxes in Delaware, all receiving exactly $500,000 from our employee pension fund." The murmur became a buzz of shocked conversation. Phones appeared in hands throughout the ballroom as people began recording this unexpected turn in the evening's entertainment. "You're fired!" Richard shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Security! Remove this woman immediately!" But the security guards weren't moving toward me. They were moving toward him. "Richard Blackwood III," said a voice from the crowd. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit pension fraud." FBI badges appeared throughout the ballroom like flowers blooming in fast motion. The guests who'd been enjoying their champagne and canapes suddenly found themselves witnesses to the largest white-collar arrest in Manhattan's recent memory. Richard stared at me with naked hatred as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself." "I know exactly what I've done," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I've stopped a thief." As they led him away, Richard turned back one final time. "Check your bank accounts tomorrow, Maggie. Check your credit report. Check your employment history. I've been planning for this possibility since the day I hired you." The threat hung in the ballroom air like smoke, but it couldn't touch me anymore. Elena appeared at my side, her hand warm on my arm. "The wire got everything," she said quietly. "His confession about Patricia, the threats, the admission about the shell companies. It's over." I looked down at the crystal plaque still clutched in my hands, in recognition of extraordinary service and unwavering loyalty. The irony was perfect. I had been loyal, just not to the person Richard expected. I'd been loyal to the truth. As the FBI finished processing the scene and the guests slowly filtered out in shocked clusters, I found myself alone on the stage where my adult life had just ended and begun simultaneously. The burgundy appointment book sat abandoned on the podium where Richard had left it, its leather binding still warm from his sweating palms. I picked it up and opened it to tonight's date. In my own careful handwriting, I'd noted, 8:00 p.m., Annual Gala, Plaza Hotel Ballroom. I'd written the ending to Richard's story without even knowing it. From the ballroom floor, Elena called up to me. "Ready to go home?" I closed the appointment book and tucked it under my arm. Tomorrow, it would become Exhibit A in a federal fraud case. Tonight, it was just a record of the last day I'd ever spend being afraid. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan felt like a cathedral of justice the morning Richard's trial began. I sat in the witness section, wearing my best navy suit, the same one I'd bought for job interviews 12 years earlier, back when I'd believed hard work and loyalty would be enough to build a secure life. How naive I'd been. The burgundy appointment book lay on the prosecutor's table, tagged as Exhibit A, its familiar leather binding now serving a purpose Richard had never intended. Every meeting I'd so carefully scheduled, every fake consultation I'd unknowingly arranged, every shell company transaction I'd documented, all of it would be projected onto screens for the jury to see. The defendant used psychological manipulation as precisely as a surgeon uses a scalpel. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen told the jury during opening statements. He identified vulnerable women, exploited their need for security, and turned their loyalty into a weapon against their own conscience. I watched Richard at the defense table, no longer the commanding presence who dominated that corner office for so many years. In his orange jumpsuit, without his expensive cologne and tailored suits, he looked smaller somehow, diminished. His silver hair had grown out gray at the roots, and his face carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd spent months in federal detention watching his empire crumble. The prosecution built their case methodically over 2 weeks. Financial experts testified about the shell company network. FBI forensic accountants walked the jury through $8.5 million in stolen pension funds. Elena Rodriguez herself took the stand to explain the pattern of psychological abuse that had driven Patricia Williams to her death. But the moment that broke Richard came when they played the wire recordings. His own voice filled the courtroom, casual and confident as he described destroying Patricia Williams' sense of self. The jury's faces grew harder with each word, their initial skepticism transforming into disgust as they heard him explain how he'd weaponized shame and guilt to drive a woman to suicide. The shame broke her, Maggie. She took the settlement money and tried to drink away the knowledge that she'd been a puppet from day one. When my voice came through the speakers, and the subway accident? Several jurors leaned forward, waiting for his response. Was inevitable. When you destroy someone's sense of self, when you show them that their entire identity was a carefully constructed lie, well, people make poor decisions when they're that broken. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at his hands, finally understanding that his own arrogance had provided the rope for his hanging. On cross-examination, his attorneys tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge through false accusations. They questioned my motives, my memory, my interpretation of events. But every attack only reinforced the central truth. I had been loyal right up until the moment I discovered that loyalty was being used to enable crimes. Ms. Sullivan, Richard's lead attorney said during my second day on the stand, isn't it true that you were bitter about being passed over for promotion? That this alleged fraud investigation was really about getting back at Mr. Blackwood for not advancing your career? I looked directly at Richard as I answered. Sir, I spent 12 years believing that my loyalty was valued and reciprocated. I discovered that my entire professional relationship was based on a psychological evaluation that identified me as someone who could be manipulated through my own need for security. That's not bitterness. That's documentation. The attorney pressed harder. But you admit you recorded these conversations without Mr. Blackwood's knowledge or consent. I documented crimes in progress. Yes. You betrayed the trust of a man who had treated you like family? He treated me like a useful tool. There's a difference. The jury convicted Richard on all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and, thanks to Elena's groundbreaking legal work, a new federal charge of psychological endangerment in furtherance of criminal conspiracy, based on his treatment of Patricia Williams. 12 years in federal prison. $47 million in asset forfeiture, $23 million in restitution to the pension fund. But the real victory came 3 months after the trial ended, when the FBI's expanded investigation revealed the scope of what Richard had been building: shell companies in 12 states, pension fraud schemes at 4 other corporations, a network of vulnerable employees identified through psychological profiling and systematically exploited over 2 decades. Patricia Williams hadn't been the first victim. She'd been the 15th. The other women, assistants, bookkeepers, HR coordinators, had similar stories. Women from difficult backgrounds who'd been grateful for stability, who'd worked hard and asked few questions, who'd discovered uncomfortable truths and been silenced through a combination of financial incentives and psychological warfare. Some had taken settlements and disappeared. Others had suffered mysterious accidents or sudden mental health crises that destroyed their credibility. 2 had committed suicide after being systematically psychologically destroyed, just like Patricia. But not all of them had been broken. Margaret Sullivan saved my life, testified Jennifer Walsh, a former bookkeeper at one of Richard's previous companies, during the sentencing hearing. When I saw her on the news, when I heard about the wire recordings, I realized I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. He really had done what I thought he'd done. One by one, they came forward. 15 women with 15 stories of manipulation, exploitation, and carefully orchestrated destruction. The judge listened to each testimony with growing horror, finally looking down at Richard with undisguised contempt. Mr. Blackwood, you didn't just steal money, you stole lives. You identified women who trusted easily because life had taught them to be grateful for small kindnesses, and you turned that gratitude into a prison. Richard's father, James Blackwood Sr., died of a heart attack 2 weeks after the sentencing. The family's reputation, built over 4 generations, crumbled in a matter of months. The Blackwood name was removed from hospital wings, scholarship funds, and country club membership rolls. Their Park Avenue penthouse was seized as part of the asset forfeiture. The family business, founded in 1892, dissolved into bankruptcy. I felt no satisfaction in their destruction. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about stopping the machinery of harm and ensuring it can't hurt anyone else. The Whistleblower Recovery Fund awarded me $4.2 million. My share of the assets recovered from Richard's criminal enterprise. More money than I'd ever imagined having, enough to never worry about security again. But I'd learned something important during those terrible months between discovery and trial. Real security doesn't come from having enough money to weather any storm. It comes from knowing you can live with the person you see in the mirror. I used part of the money to establish the Patricia Williams Foundation, providing legal support and financial assistance to corporate whistleblowers. The rest went into a scholarship fund for women from difficult backgrounds seeking education in financial forensics and corporate law. Elena Rodriguez became the foundation's legal director, bringing her 15 years of experience to bear on a problem we now understood was much larger than any individual case. "How many Richard Blackwoods are out there?" I asked her one afternoon as we reviewed applications for the scholarship fund. "Too many," she said, "but now we know how to find them." 2 years later, I stood in my new office, 23rd floor, decent view, my name on the door in simple black letters. Margaret Sullivan, Executive Director, Patricia Williams Foundation. The burgundy appointment book sat on my desk, no longer a tool of complicity or evidence of crimes, but a reminder of how far I'd traveled from that terrified woman who'd once arranged fake meetings without knowing what they really meant. The foundation had grown beyond anything Elena and I had imagined. 67 cases in 18 months. Corporate whistleblowers from coast to coast, mostly women, mostly from backgrounds that had taught them to be grateful for stability and reluctant to rock boats that kept them afloat. But we were teaching them something different now, that speaking truth to power isn't betrayal, it's courage. "Ms. Sullivan?" My assistant knocked on the open door. Sarah Chen. No relation to the prosecutor. Just a young woman with fierce intelligence and a story remarkably similar to my own. "The 3 o'clock appointment is here." I looked up from the case files spread across my desk. Another pension fraud scheme, this one in Chicago. Another loyal employee who'd noticed irregularities and was struggling with the terrible choice between conscience and security. "Send her in." The woman who entered could have been me 24 months earlier. Professionally dressed but not expensively so, carrying herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to making herself useful and unobtrusive. Her eyes held the particular strain that comes from sleepless nights spent wondering if you're going crazy or if the people you trust really are stealing everything that matters. "Miss Sullivan? I'm Janet Morrison. I think my boss is stealing from our retirement fund." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. The same burgundy leather as the appointment book, chosen deliberately as a reminder that tools of oppression could be transformed into instruments of justice. "Tell me everything, Janet. Start from the beginning." As she spoke, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, I saw myself as I'd been in that corner office 47 floors above Manhattan. Loyal, grateful, desperate to believe that hard work and discretion would be rewarded with security and respect. I'd learned better. More importantly, I'd learned how to teach others the difference between loyalty and complicity. "What happens if I come forward?" Janet asked finally. "What happens to my life?" It was the question they all asked, and it deserved an honest answer. "It's hard," I said. "There will be retaliation, legal challenges, attempts to destroy your credibility. Corporate predators have decades of practice silencing people like us." Her face fell, and I recognized the moment when courage began to waver in the face of practical reality. "But," I continued, "you won't face it alone. We have resources now, legal protection, financial support, a network of people who understand exactly what you're going through. Most importantly, we have proof that speaking up works." I turned my computer screen toward her, showing the Foundation's case tracker. 67 investigations. 43 successful prosecutions, $812 million in recovered assets. Most importantly, 0 clients who'd suffered the kind of systematic psychological destruction that had claimed Patricia Williams and others. Richard Blackwood spent 20 years perfecting a system for identifying and exploiting vulnerable women. But systems can be broken if you understand how they work. Janet leaned forward, studying the numbers. "How many people like him are out there?" "Too many, but fewer than there were 2 years ago." We talked for another hour, walking through the process, the protections, the realistic timeline for building a case strong enough to ensure conviction rather than settlement. By the time she left, Janet Morrison had the tools and support network that I'd never had until Elena Rodriguez appeared in my life. That evening, I stood at my office window watching Manhattan's lights flicker on across the darkening skyline. Somewhere out there, other loyal employees were staying late, puzzling over irregularities in financial records, struggling with the terrible knowledge that their trust was being weaponized against their conscience. But now, they had somewhere to turn. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Chicago FBI wants to coordinate with Morrison case. This is going to be big." I smiled and picked up the burgundy appointment book, running my fingers over its familiar leather binding. Tomorrow's page was already filled with appointments. Meetings with prosecutors, calls with potential clients, strategy sessions with investigators who'd learned to recognize the patterns that had once been invisible. Richard Blackwood had taught me something valuable, though not what he'd intended. Loyalty is indeed everything in business. But true loyalty serves justice, not the powerful. It protects the vulnerable, not the predators. From my desk drawer, I pulled out a newspaper clipping I'd saved from the day after Richard's sentencing. The headline read, "Corporate Whistleblower Network Expands Nationwide." Below it was a photograph of me and Elena at a press conference, announcing the foundation's launch. I looked tired in the photo, but not broken. Determined rather than desperate. It was the face of someone who'd learned the difference between security and safety, between compliance and integrity. Justice isn't always swift, but it's often more satisfying than revenge. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very careful and very brave, it's the beginning of something better than anything you ever imagined possible. I closed the appointment book and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to transform tools of oppression into instruments of justice. But tonight, I was going home to my small apartment in Queens, the same one I'd lived in for 8 years, chosen not because I couldn't afford better, but because I'd finally learned the difference between having enough and having everything. It was enough.